There Might Be Hope. Chapter 3. Native Farmers. The oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them when the Sabaeans raided them and took them away. Indeed, they have killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Job 1:14-15. Arable. To plow. Latin. Capable of producing crops suitable for farming, suited to the plow, or for tillage. Haw. Today these words may bring to mind clownish, frolicsome, country-themed events where cheap straw hats, hayrides, face painting, and flannel abound. In ages past, though, they represented teamwork, hard labor, and sustenance. Ye, likely a corrupted form of ghee, translates to go right. Haw commanded a plow animal to go left. These directional terms were spoken by a plowman to guide his draft team. Variations of these terms are thought to date back to at least the 1500s, and likely well beyond. But plowing, as a practice, appears to have grown up alongside the foundations of human civilization. Commonly thought to date back to at least 2000 BC, early plowing references frequently appear in ancient Egyptian artwork and written biblical accounts, such as Job losing his 500 yoke of oxen to the Sabaean raiders. The donkeys grazing beside Job's plowing oxen were likely an agricultural technique used to trim down tall grasses and clear the fields for easier plowing. From antiquity until the 1900s, plowing was an intensely physical task and generally limited to a double yoke of heavy-boned, sure-footed oxen followed by a plowman. Wealthier operations might have had the benefit of a mule team or even draft horses. For millennia, oxen, mules, and horses were specifically bred for this purpose. Stout-boned and muscular, these heavy lifters or gentle giants of the livestock world listen attentively with willing hearts for the verbal commands, step up, ye, haw, whoa. In spite of the work's fatiguing nature, most draft animals seem to genuinely enjoy their jobs and the camaraderie that comes with it. The reins often lie slack as they pull forward eagerly on their own at a brisk walk. While trusting and relying on his team, the man behind the plow must be quick to keep up, even while finding his own way over both unbroken and freshly turned earth. Upper body and core strength are tested as he rights, maneuvers, and steadies a heavy 100 to 170 pounds of plow that often wants to swerve, pitch, and dive away from the unbroken ground back into the last furrow. A pragmatic physicist, an accurate mathematician, and a meticulous mechanic, the skilled plowman deftly applies his knowledge and understanding to a variety of soil and weather conditions. Like a captain guiding his crew to harness the wind as he steers the ship's rudder, a good farmer harnesses the strength of his team while overseeing the rudder of the soil, the plow. The results appear simple. The plow slices through the soil, lifts it up, and folds the surface layer over and under. Like folding an omelet, the end result of a well-plowed field ought to display straight, smooth lines. The straighter the row, the more space-efficient a crop is, and the greater the potential yield. Poor weather or soil conditions, an inexperienced or poorly led team, ill-calibrated or ill-fitting equipment. Any of these results in a field that more closely resembles a plate of poorly mixed scrambled eggs. Prior to the advent of tractors, a furrow, the space between plant rows, was just wide enough for a single plow horse to walk down. Most plows created 1 or 2 furrows at a pass. At utmost, furrows ran 200 yards in length. This was the maximum distance a team could comfortably pull a plow in ideal soil before needing a break to catch their breath. In average to poor conditions, furrows held closer to 100 yards long or required a stronger, larger team. A full day's plowing for a solid team in good conditions meant plowing an American football field, or a little more than an acre. This is where the term horsepower hails from. 1 horse equals 1 horsepower, the equivalent workload a single draft horse can comfortably pull in a day. It's said that 2 well-worked acres could comfortably feed a family of 5, and an 8-acre homestead was about the maximum a man would want to tackle on his own. When John Deere's revolutionary steel plow debuted in 1837, its unique curvature and glossy smooth surface empowered farmers to cut through thick, sticky prairie soils with previously unimaginable ease and speed. It was a tremendous step forward, but barely a century later, the emergence of tractor and hydraulic power would replace draft livestock altogether. The acre of plowing that once took a team all day now takes as little as about 5 minutes, literally. It might be difficult to overestimate the sheer physical relief that the invention of the tractor brought to modern agriculture. The team's strength and the prowess of the man behind the plow to keep it upright once determined depth and the evenness of rows. Today, plowing depth can easily be adjusted from a touch-sensitive computer screen mounted next to an air-ride equipped lumbar-supported leather seat within an air-conditioned cab. LED lighting, Bluetooth, 4G, online tractor diagnostics, and a farm GPS guidance system offer further comfort and support. That is if a farmer can afford them. Tractor sticker shock is real. Fresh off the lot, a new farm tractor can easily run double the cost of the average American home. Regardless, agriculture's traditional constraints of a team's physical exertion and available daylight don't limit the size of a field anymore. The invention of the tractor didn't really make an inherently difficult job easy. It simply made accomplishing it on a much larger scale possible. On the one hand, it meant fewer farmers could feed more people than ever before, and on the other hand, meant that decreased food prices forced farmers to produce greater and greater yields to survive themselves. Producing greater yields required increasingly larger and more powerful equipment. Early tractors meant an immediate difference between the strength of 2 horses requiring care, feeding, and shoeing, and the power of 15 to 25 horses that didn't require a pasture of their own pulling in unison. The trade-off came in seasonal machine maintenance, greasing bearings, changing belts, changing oil, and airing up tires. While a major improvement in terms of workload, these early tractors were a far cry from today's agricultural tractors, which boast 200 to 600 horsepower. Imagine 600 draft horses pulling in unison across a field, and you've got the modern agricultural tractor. Along with increased power came increased weight. Altogether, a team of draft horses and oxen with complete harness, plow, and plowman might weigh in at 5,000 pounds. Contrast this with today's closer to 40,000 pounds of precision agricultural equipment pressing down upon the earth. Tack on a plow and or other implements, and another 10 to 20,000 pounds gets added into the mix. It's in part the craftsmanship that thriving subterranean microbial civilizations pour into their infrastructure and airways that enables them to survive below the surface. And in part, it's their sheer proximity to the surface that enables them to access the oxygen they need. Most of soil life dwells in the upper 6 inches of the soil, the topsoil. But like most living creatures in their dwellings, topsoil simply wasn't built to withstand a concentrated 50 to 60,000 pounds repeatedly rolling over it. If you've ever been stepped on by a horse, you've likely lived to tell your painful tale. But what about being run over by a tractor? Every pass of these modern beasts of burden gradually weakens and ultimately collapses subterranean infrastructure, suffocating and crushing aerobic microbial life within. Imagine a woman in sub-Saharan Africa walking to the well to gather water for her family. Through much practice and necessity, she deftly balances a 5-gallon jerry can of water on her head. It's challenging, but possible. Now imagine the same woman balancing 50 times that load vertically on her head. This is what we've been asking our soils to do under the weight of increasing machinery. Between plowing, planting, fertilizing, and harvesting, making 12 to 15 passes over a field in a season with a tractor and various implements is not uncommon. Farm soils are increasingly pulverized into more of a road base than a soil microbial nursery. It's a vicious cycle. As the soil becomes increasingly compacted, the response is generally more plowing to recreate the subsurface airways that plants rely on to breathe and that soil microbes intuitively build. Plowing is probably the most common form of tilling, but there are many forms of tilling. The common goal of all tilling is preparing the soil for planting by killing competing weeds and breaking up the soil. Why we till is simple, but the best methods for tilling remain as up for debate today as they have since antiquity. The ancient Greeks who plowed first and then sowed were quite amazed at the Egyptians who carried out planting by reverse fashion. By breaking up the soil, young seedling roots were thought to be able to burrow down into it more easily. To this end, tilling was also believed to improve tilth, the silkiness or feel of a soil. The greater the tilth, the more freely soil slipped between your fingers. Back when soil was believed to be a purely lifeless mineral medium and chemical conduit, this all made perfect sense, or seemed to. The soil needed our help. It had no natural God-given mechanism to create soil infrastructure that would bring oxygen to plant roots and allow them to grow well. Only it did, and it does. The soil is not a lifeless mineral medium. Tilling tines or plow blades slicing through the ground do not simply smooth out soil consistency and uproot competing plants. They wreck soil microbiomes, the same microbiomes that genuinely build tilth. Like a ground-splitting earthquake preceding an avalanche of soil and plant debris, tilling rips apart microbial communities and infrastructure, while collapsing soil microbial airways, burying air-breathing microbes alive and suffocating them under 4 to 12 inches of soil chaos. Among the wreckage lie broken strands of mycorrhizae. Like most fungi, mycorrhizae reproduce through spores. Unlike fungi above ground, though, mycorrhizae spores aren't carried along by wind or water. Traveling below ground, they meander from root to root or hitch a ride with an earthworm until they match and marry the plant of their dreams. A few species of mycorrhizae grow well with many different varieties of plants, but nearly every species of mycorrhizae has one family of plants that they're partial to. Once the mycorrhizae and its plant are wed, they grow and mature together for a year before producing spores of their own. Herein lies the trouble. Most major food crops like wheat, corn, and soy aren't rooted in the ground for a year. They're rooted for a season. At the season's end, they're harvested, and the remains are often plowed under, thus ending the union of mycorrhizae and plant before the next generation of spores can be sent off. When oxygenated muscle was the limiting factor in furrow length, crop roots were closer to field borders. Unplowed, field-framing borders hosted vibrant nurseries brimming with healthy and diverse soil microbiomes that were able to send out fungal spores, bacteria, and microbes to replenish nearby depleted crop fields. Even if the crops themselves were too short-lived for their own mycorrhizae to reproduce, spores were still close enough to repopulate new crop roots. The sheer, uninterrupted expanses of today's farm fields, however, mean that after tilling initially shreds and crushes mycorrhizae, undisturbed, healthy soil microbiomes are too far away to effectively restock these fields. Healthy, fertile microbial nurseries are being pushed into smaller and smaller reservoirs or microbiome preserves. over time between the continued cycle of mycorrhiza's inability to reach reproductive maturity and the destruction of existing colonies through heavy tilling. Many species of mycorrhizae are driven to extinction across our farm fields. Amazingly, some mycorrhizae species from the family Glomeraceae may survive plowing. These individuals have the unique ability to reconnect and heal broken fragments when nearby. They can even give birth to spores from them. Of the 342 currently known mycorrhizae species, though, these are the exception. And despite Glomeraceae's resilience, many farm fields have no mycorrhizae at all. The mycorrhizae dating game is a tricky one. Not every plant is attracted to every mycorrhizae species. Scientists don't yet understand the mechanisms behind these attractions or preferences, but when these matches blossom and thrive, the compatibility is obvious. Happy mycorrhizae marriages results in far healthier plants and dramatic yield increases. The recent flood of new mycorrhizae species discoveries haunts us with the question of how many unique, precious mycorrhizae species intensive farming methods may have unknowingly and unintentionally obliterated throughout human history. Certainly at one time the lands of ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, and ancient Leptis Magna were propelled towards greatness, in part, due to mycorrhizae. Were these species the same Glomeraceae we find in farm fields today, or were there others that fed their landlords richly before falling victim to overzealous plowing? Conversely, how often throughout the millennia has man cursed the inherent difficulty of plowing the land without realizing that his natural limitations of physical strength were sheltering our very survival? Homeostasis, it's a particular pH range, a particular pressure, a certain level of oxygen saturation. The human body knows this continuity and equilibrium are essential to life. So does the soil. Fungal communities, bacterial communities, and protists and nematodes have an amazing ability to self-regulate their own metabolism and act as a buffering system to protect plants and themselves from smaller changes or imbalances in the soil's metabolism. They will even voluntarily shut down the growth of their own community at times to help maintain this homeostasis. Like our own bodies, though, there are limits to this, and systems can become overwhelmed by external forces. Short-term imbalances may be temporarily endured and repaired, but long-term imbalances lead to illness and ultimately death for soils. Included in this homeostasis is the regulation of soil protein and carbon. Soil's glue, safety net, and kitchen pantry, carbon is the singular element that all living creatures share in common. The study of organic chemistry is the study of carbon life forms. Healthy soil microbiomes have diversified sources and stores of carbon, just as they have checks and balances between bacteria and fungi. These carbon reserves are also the primary building blocks and food sources for all of life, and especially the soil microbiome, the genesis point for all nutrition. For the soil microbiome, carbon is the bread of life. Man may succeed on a low-carb diet, but the soil microbiome does not. Carbon is often the limiting factor in soil microbiome growth and diversity. Healthy, fertile farm soils maintain a carbon-to-protein ratio of about 12 to 1. And they do so in part by regulating protein production among a diverse variety of soil microbial communities. Carbon is the foundation of soil's economy, but complex protein production is the peak of its economic cycle. It is the zenith of soil civilization as we know it. The greater a soil's carbon reserves are, the more that soil microbiome's protein economy has room to grow. Dense and diverse soil microbiomes expertly build complex proteins as well as break them down into simpler amino acids. If carbon reserves represent a soil microbiome's capacity for work, then amino acids might be thought of as a common global currency that functions in every life system. The building blocks for all protein and DNA synthesis, amino acids, serve as a primary food source for microbial plant and human life. The larger and more complex the soil microbiome's carbon reserves are, the more resources it has to build organic proteins into the soil biomass. Like the grain reserves of Egypt, healthy soils also stock up their carbon reserves for future times of need. Farming by nature is an exercise in faith, and control is something farmers historically have had to live without. For thousands of years, prior to the Haber-Bosch process, farmers fertilized their fields with whatever resources were immediately available to them. Generally, this meant manure, of whatever variety was handy. The healthier the individual it emanated from, the richer in nutrients the manure would be. More an art than science, fertilizing with manure meant applying manure to the plant at just the right time. Manures that are too fresh will burn plant tissues with excessive nitrogen. Manures that are too old have already lost their nutritional value into the atmosphere and environment by evaporation and leaching. No one knew the actual chemical composition of a batch of manure, let alone how much of a particular nutrient a fertilizer added to their crops. Post-World War II, mass-produced inorganic Haber-Bosch nitrogen began to be paired with inorganic phosphorus and potassium, creating the first synthetic inorganic NPK or nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium fertilizers. And suddenly, for the first time in all of human history, we could control the specific amounts of individual nutrients we applied to crops and easily purchase more if needed. The name inorganic fertilizer, true to chemistry nomenclature, simply implied that unlike traditional manures, these fertilizers didn't contain any living or formerly alive ingredients. By definition, inorganic fertilizers were extremely simplistic chemical structures containing little to no carbon. Traditionally, agriculturists believed that if a little fertilizer was good, a lot more was better. This hailed from the era, though, when fertilizers generally came from manures that farmers had on hand. With the birth of the Green Revolution, though, synthetic and organic fertilizers had to be budgeted for and purchased. The question soon became, how much NPK did plants need and in what ratio? The yardstick to determine how much synthetic and organic NPK we needed to apply was by measuring how much was already in the soil and then calculating how much nitrogen a crop would need above that. When in doubt, it was deemed better to have too much fertilizer than to have a slow-growing crop. Troublingly, though, many crops' appetite for synthetic and organic NPK fertilizers seemed both voracious and insatiable. Increasing amounts of nitrogen were almost constantly needed to produce the same yields as before. In 1961, about 11 million tons of synthetic nitrogen were produced and sold as fertilizer. Today, that number is closing in on 200 million tons. Simply because a soil tests as deficient in a nutrient doesn't mean that the plant growing in that soil is also deficient. In one European study, vineyard soil tested as low in available inorganic phosphorus. Logically, we would presume that the grapes grown in these soils were also deficient in phosphorus. However, when tested, the grapes had all the phosphorus they needed. According to our inorganic soil theory, this shouldn't have been possible. How had the grapes had the nutrients they needed if the soil was deficient? Their roots were covered with mycorrhizae. More amazingly, the mycorrhizae seem to intuitively know which nutrients and in what amounts to provide different species of grapevines. Our sophisticated soil tests tell us how much of a nutrient is in the soil. The mycorrhizae don't have to test the soil. They know exactly what and how much each plant needs. They will hunt down and retrieve whatever the plant needs. Even in soils where we don't think there are enough available minerals for the plant, the mycorrhizae can transform undigestible nutrients into digestible forms. Sometimes popular science supports and promotes a working theory as fact that is ultimately disproven. In the early 20th century, alongside the Haber-Bosch debut, a single study was conducted to determine whether plants preferred organic or inorganic nitrogen. The study concluded that plants definitively preferred inorganic nitrogen and that it was naturally abundant. Thus, organic nitrogen in the form of complex proteins and amino acids, like those abundantly found in the healthiest soils, weren't believed to be of any use to plants. Dramatic yield increases produced by new hybrid crop species following synthetic inorganic nitrogen applications seemed to confirm this shaky science. Thus, the stage was set for an explosion of inorganic nitrogen usage and broad spread acceptance of the simply named nitrogen theory. Only later on did it come to light that the environment chosen for the study was highly polluted with industrial waste, but not before a flawed nitrogen theory had been taught as fact to generations. Now we know that only sick and dying soil microbiomes contain abundant quantities of inorganic nitrogen. In healthy farm soils, even the most basic of organic nitrogen are only short-term byproducts of amino acid and subsequent complex protein production. In healthy soils, protein creation cycles are constantly taking place, and unincorporated nitrogen typically doesn't last long. These complex proteins and amino acids, unlike basic nitrogen, are bound by lots and lots of carbon. Thus, complex protein creation within the soil requires not only nitrogen, but also abundant carbon resources. Hence, farm soil prefers a 12-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio to keep steadily producing these complex proteins and amino acids and to properly feed its plant partners. The same amino acids that the human body depends upon function as the currency of the soil. Unsurprisingly, when given the choice, plants, like people, also prefer to consume the vast majority of their protein and amino acid form. Free amino acids don't last long in the soil microbiome. They are gobbled up within minutes to hours, and in healthy soils, this process is constantly occurring. In nature, seasonal plant decomposition and animal manures slowly and steadily add carbon back into soils along with nitrogen. When synthetic inorganic nitrogen or ammonia is applied to farm soils, soil microbiomes must turn to their own carbon pantries, soil acids, and glomalin to build the complex proteins and amino acids they thrive upon. If soil microbes don't have enough carbon, they can't build complex proteins and amino acids to expand their soil kingdoms. Like a besieged city whose starving citizens are searching for a morsel of flour to make bread with, soil microbes stripped of their carbon savings will hunt down free soil amino acids and begin breaking them apart to salvage and consume the carbon and other nutrients they need to survive. What's left over? Basic organic nitrogen in the form of ammonium. In a complete reversal of the theory we've been taught and built our agriculture around for the past 70 years, it turns out that plants actually prefer amino acids over basic organic nitrogen. And they prefer organic nitrogen over inorganic nitrogen. Yet we've been heaping synthetic inorganic nitrogen on our fields worldwide for over 70 years. What happens when we continue to apply more synthetic inorganic nitrogen to a besieged and carbon-starved soil microbiome? As excess nitrogen accumulates, soil microbes continue to hastily pillage their carbon pantries for any remaining complex protein, amino acids, and fatty acids they can break apart to get carbon from to balance their own diets with. If they run out of enough carbon, they die, and the carbon to nitrogen ratio shifts even further towards nitrogen dominance, intensifying the cycle and creating an increasingly hostile environment towards any remaining soil life. Natural hunters and gatherers of complex proteins and amino acids, mycorrhizae don't absorb either synthetic nitrogen or phosphorus well and are highly sensitive to excesses of both in their environment. At best, as nitrogen accumulates in the soil, mycorrhizae growth becomes stunted, and they colonize fewer and fewer plant roots. At worst, overzealous and repetitious applications of synthetic inorganic NPK fertilizers can quickly obliterate any existing mycorrhizae. Earthworms, tiny nematodes, and insects, the long distance truckers of the soil that transport sensitive fungal spores, respond to excessive ammonium as the poisonous volatile gas that it is and simply die. Providentially, the soil microbiome has an emergency relief valve to remove excess nitrogen and phosphorus. In a desperate attempt to maintain soil homeostasis, the soil microbiome releases excess nitrogen back to where Carl Haber got it from, our atmosphere. That's where the majority of agricultural synthetic inorganic nitrogen winds up. Around 60% of nitrogen fertilizers applied to the soil are either vaporized into the atmosphere or washed away into streams and creeks. Only about 40% of NPK fertilizers applied to a field are absorbed by crops. The other 60% ultimately fertilizes our skies and oceans. As the soil microbiome shifts away from being a healthy, thriving civilization towards nitrogen dominance, plants are no longer protected and fed the balanced diet of complex proteins, fatty acids, minerals, and antibiotics that a soil microbiome inherently provides. Plant survival mandates increasing reliance upon synthetic inorganic chemicals from a fertilizer sprayer, like transitioning from a locally grown, freshly harvested, home cooked meal to being tube fed in a hospital. Helpless and unprotected plants must either depend upon synthetic inorganic fertilizers or die. Tube feeding synthetic nutrients may cause rapid growth in plants, but it doesn't offer the nutrient and mineral density that a healthy soil microbiome can. We have traded short-term crop yields for long-term soil health. Soil microbiomes are strong and will battle for their survival, despite plowing and synthetic inorganic nitrogen halting the production of natural carbon reserves and devouring existing ones. In many places, a remnant of the soil microbiome lives on, albeit diminished in size and strength. No bacteria and no fungus equals no carbon reserves. Glomalin and humic and fulvic acids, the carbon and amino acid storehouses of the soil, are no longer being built and stocked. The many aquifers of humic and fulvic acids and glomalin that store water, alternatively cooling plants in summer, insulating them in winter, and staving off the effects of drought, are no longer being built. Unsurprisingly, as these carbon reservoirs are consumed, the remaining sand, silt, and clay minerals don't absorb or hold water as they once did. Instead of pulling water into their structures and then acting like little microbial sandbags, shielding the soil beneath from rising waters, absentee soil acids and glomalin mean increased flash floods that wreak havoc on our unprotected soils. The rainfall amounts of modern-day Leptis magna and other parts of the Middle East don't appear to have changed much over the years, but it is the soil's ability to absorb water that has changed. The creeping process of soil formation shifts downward to an even slower pace. As stored sources of carbon become scarcer and scarcer, the soil microbiome becomes increasingly cannibalistic and opportunistic, devouring each other like a microbial Mad Max battlefield until remaining carbon sources are utterly consumed from the soil. Farm fields lose both the ability to transport and store nutrients. Vital nutrients such as calcium and potassium slowly ooze out of the soil and are washed away. No longer shielded by humic and fulvic acids and unanchored by matted strands of mycorrhizae, remaining soil minerals bereft of both their inhabitants and defenders readily erode away when confronted with abrasive elements such as wind and rain. The former dwelling places and mighty microbial ruins are easily ransacked and swifted away by wind and water. Like the abandoned ruins of Leptis Magna, sand, silt, or clay, soil's mineral attributes, may still be used to physically identify their old haunts, but the glory, the industry, the growth, and the life are all gone. Our once healthy and vibrant soil microbiomes are being supplanted by tube-feeding synthetic inorganic nitrogen. Any farmer today would have to be over 100 years old to have known farming in soils before NPK. For farmers who grew up after 1950 and the introduction of synthetic inorganic fertilizers, the deadly effects of these now everyday tools of the trade are baffling. How could the Green Revolution's high-yielding farming techniques that saved millions of lives be simultaneously destroying our soil? Healthy, fertile soils largely haven't existed in 70 years now. Most of our benchmarks for judging soil health are askew. Today's farmers have never felt them, never smelt them, never tasted them. When sick, depleted soils are all you've ever known, recognizing that soil is sick and depleted can be challenging. Overzealous plowing and synthetic nitrogen applications have brought soil microbial death on a massive scale. For decades, we saw the aftermath of the battle drifting down the mighty Mississippi without understanding what was happening because we didn't know that the soils had been alive. As unique and ancient soil microbiomes died off from field to field, we only saw that plants were needing more and more nitrogen to produce the same yields. We couldn't see that every inorganic nitrogen application only further depleted final carbon reservoirs. The result was unbridled erosion. Erosion is not the malady that kills topsoil. It is the hearse that carries off the deceased remains following carbon depletion. It is not an American phenomenon. It is an impending global disaster. Farm soils devoid of a healthy, balanced soil microbiome are farm fields on borrowed time. Erosion isn't a cause, it's a result. Erosion didn't cause the loss of 70% or more of one of our most precious resources. It's the result of soil microbial death. It's the dispersal of the mineral estate that microbial life once held together. Erosion is merely an undertaker, employing wind and water as the hearse. It's as if we spent decades, even millennia, studying the redistribution of personal items following an estate sale, asking how personal effects will be packed, where they will go, and how they will get there. We've contemplated these effects, all the while overlooking the singular event that brought us here in the first place: death. That's the end of Chapter 3. Thank you so much for listening. Please like and subscribe to this channel if you enjoyed this, so you can be updated when the next chapter comes out. If you'd like more notes and background information about this chapter, you can find that on my Patreon site. And thank you so much. Bye.